Navy of the future. Arnold's instructions from the Council had been to remain in Aeria and make a thorough exploration of the wonderful region described in Lewis Holt's manuscript, until the time came for him to meet the Avondale, the steamer which was to bring out the materials for constructing the terrorists' aerial navy. Lewis Holt and his faithful retainer, during the 3 years and a half that they had been shut up in it from the rest of the world, had made themselves so fully acquainted with its geography that very little of its surface was represented by blanks on the map which the former had spent several months in constructing, and so no better or more willing guides could have been placed at their service than they were. Holt was an enthusiastic naturalist, and he descanted at great length on the strangeness of the flora and fauna that it had been his privilege to discover and classify in this isolated and hitherto unvisited region. It appeared that neither its animals nor its plants were quite like those of the rest of the continent, but seemed rather to belong to an anterior geological age. From this fact he had come to the conclusion that at some very remote period, while the greater portion of northern Africa was yet submerged by the waters of that ocean, of which what is now the Sahara was probably the deepest part, Aeria was one of the many islands that had risen above its surface, and that as the land rose and the waters subsided, its peculiar shape had prevented the forms of life which it contained from migrating or becoming modified in the struggle for existence with other forms, just as the flora and fauna of Australia have been shut off from those of the rest of the world. There were no traces of human inhabitants to be found, but there were apparently 2 or 3 families of anthropoid apes that seemed, so far as Holt had been able to judge, for they were extremely shy and cunning, and therefore difficult to approach, to be several degrees nearer to man, both in structure and intelligence, than any other members of the simian family that had been discovered in other parts of the world. As may well be imagined, a month passed rapidly and pleasantly away, what with exploring excursions by land and air, in the latter of which by no means the least diverting element was the keen and quaintly expressed delight of Lewis Holt at the new method of travel. 2 or 3 times Arnold had, for his satisfaction, sent the Ariel flying over the ridge across which she had entered Aeria, but he had always been content with a glimpse of the outside world, and was always glad to get back again to the Happy Valley, as he invariably called his isolated paradise. The brief sojourn at this delightful land had brought back all the roses to Natasha's lovely cheeks, and had completely restored both her and the princess to the perfect health that they had lost during their short but terrible experience of Russian convict life. But towards the end of the month they both began to get restless and anxious to get away to the rendezvous with the steamer that was bringing their friends and comrades out from England. So it came about that an hour or so after sunrise, on Friday the 20th of May, the company of the Ariel bade farewell for a time to Lewis Holt and his companion, leaving them with a good supply of the creature comforts of civilization, which alone were lacking in Aeria, rose into the air and disappeared over the ridge to the northwest. They had rather more than 2,500 miles of plain and mountain and desert to cross before they reached the sea coast on which they expected to meet the steamer, and Arnold regulated the speed of the Ariel so that they would reach it about daybreak on the following morning. The voyage was quite uneventful, and the course that they pursued led them westward through the Zegzeb and Niti countries, and northwestward along the valley of the Niger, and then westward across the desert to the desolate sandy shores of the western Sahara, which they crossed at sunrise on the Sunday morning in the latitude of the island which was to form their rendezvous with the steamer. They sighted the island about an hour later, but there was no sign of any vessel for 50 miles round it. The ocean appeared totally deserted, as indeed it usually is, for there is no trade with this barren and savage coast, and ships going to and from the southward portions of the continent give its treacherous sandbanks as wide a berth as possible. This, in fact, was the principal reason why this rocky islet, some 60 miles from the coast, had been chosen by the terrorists for their temporary dockyard. According to their calculations, the steamer would not be due for another 24 hours at the least, and at that moment would be about 300 miles to the northward. The Ariel was therefore headed in that direction at 100 miles an hour, with a view to meeting her and convoying her for the rest of the voyage, and obviating such a disaster as Natasha's apprehensions pointed to. The airship was kept at a height of 2,000 feet above the water, and a man was stationed in the forward conning tower to keep a bright lookout ahead. For more than 3 hours she sped on her way without interruption, and then, a few minutes before 12, the man in the conning tower signalled to the wheelhouse, "Steamer in sight." The signal was at once transmitted to the saloon, where Arnold was sitting with the rest of the party. He immediately signalled half speed in reply to it, and went to the conning tower to see the steamer for himself. She was then about 12 miles to the northward. At the speed at which the Ariel was travelling, a very few minutes sufficed to bring her within view of the ocean voyagers. A red flag flying from the stern of the airship was answered by a similar one from the mainmast of the steamer. The Ariel's engines were at once slowed down, the fan wheels went aloft, and she sank gently down to within 20 feet of the water, and swung round the steamer's stern. As soon as they were within hailing distance, those on board the airship recognised Nicholas Roburoff and his wife, Radna Michaelis, and several other members of the inner circle, standing on the bridge of the steamer. Handkerchiefs were waved, and cries of welcome and greeting passed and repassed from air to the sea, until Arnold raised his hand for silence, and hailing Roburoff said, "Are you all well on board?" "Yes, all well," was the reply, "though we have had a rather risky time of it, for war was generally declared a fortnight ago, and we have had to run the blockade for a good part of the way. That is why we are a little before our time. Can you come nearer? We have some letters for you." "Yes," replied Arnold, "I'll come alongside. You go ahead, I'll do the rest." So saying, he ran the Ariel up close to the quarter of the Avondale, as easily as though she had been lying at anchor, instead of going 20 miles an hour through the water, and went forward and shook hands with Roburoff over the rail, taking a packet of letters from him at the same time. Meanwhile, Colston, who had grasped the situation at a glance, had swung himself onto the steamer's deck, and was already engaged in an animated conversation with Radna. The first advantage that Arnold took of the leisure that was now at his disposal was to read the letter directed to himself that was among those for Natasha, the Princess, and Colston, which had been brought out by the Avondale. He recognised the writing as Tremayne's, and when he opened the envelope he found that it contained a somewhat lengthy letter from him, and an enclosure in an unfamiliar hand, which consisted of only a few lines and was signed Natas. He started as his eye fell on the terrible name, which now meant so much to him, and he naturally read the note to which it was appended first. There was neither date nor formal address, and it ran as follows: "You have done well, and fulfilled your promises as a true man should. For the personal service you have rendered to me, I will not thank you in words, for the time may come when I shall be able to do so in deeds. What you have done for the cause was your duty, and for that I know you desire no thanks. Prove that you hold in your hands such power as no single man ever wielded before. Use it well, and in the ages to come men shall remember your name with blessings, and you, if the Master of Destiny permits, shall attain to your heart's desire. Natas." Arnold laid the little slip of paper down almost reverently, for, few as the words were, they were those of a man who was not only Natas, the Master of the Terror, but also the father of the woman whose love, in spite of his oath, was the object to the attainment of which he held all things else as secondary, and who therefore had the power to crown his life work with the supreme blessing without which it would be worthless, however glorious, for he knew full well that, though he might win Natasha's heart, she herself could never be his unless Natas gave her to him. The other letter was from Tremayne, dated more than a fortnight previously, and gave him a brief résumé of the course of events in Europe since his voyage of exploration had begun. It also urged him to push on the construction of the aerial navy as fast as possible, as there was now no telling where or how soon its presence might be required to determine the issue of the World War, the first skirmishes of which had already taken place in Eastern Europe. Natas and the chief were both in London, making the final arrangements for the direction of the various diplomatic and military agents of the Brotherhood throughout Europe. From London they were to go to Alanmere, where they would remain until all arrangements were completed. As soon as the fleet was built and the crews and commanders of the airships had thoroughly learned their duties, the flagship was to go to Plymouth, where the Lurline would be lying. The news of her arrival would be telegraphed to Alanmere, and Natas and Tremaine would at once come south and put to sea in her. The airship was to wait for them at a point 200 miles due southwest of Land's End and pick them up. The yacht was then to be sunk, and the executive of the terrorists would for the time being vanish from the sight of men. It is unnecessary to say that Arnold carried out the plans laid down in this letter in every detail, and with the utmost possible expedition. The Avondale arrived the next day at the island which had been chosen as a dockyard, and the shipbuilding was at once commenced. All the material for constructing the airships had been brought out completely finished, as far as each individual part was concerned, and so there was nothing to do but to put them together. The crew and passengers of the steamer included the members of the executive of the Inner Circle and 60 picked members of the Outer Circle, chiefly mechanics and sailors, destined to be first the builders and then the crews of the new vessels. These, under Arnold's directions, worked almost day and night at the task before them. 3 of the airships were put together at a time, 20 men working at each, and within a month from the time that the Avondale discharged her cargo, the 12 new vessels were ready to take the air. They were all built on the same plan as the Ariel, and 11 of them were practically identical with her as regards size and speed, but the 12th, the flagship of the aerial fleet, had been designed by Arnold on a more ambitious scale. This vessel was larger and much more powerful than any of the others. She was 100 feet long, with a beam of 15 feet amidships. On her 5 masts she carried 5 fan wheels, capable of raising her vertically to a height of 10,000 feet without the assistance of her airplanes, and her 3 propellers, each worked by duplex engines, were able to drive her through the air at a speed of 200 miles an hour in a calm atmosphere. She was armed with 2 pneumatic guns forward and 2 aft, each 25 feet long, with a range of 12 miles at an altitude of 4,000 feet, and in addition to these she carried 2 shorter ones on each broadside with a range of 6 miles at the same elevation. She also carried sufficient supply of power cylinders to give her an effective range of operations of 20,000 miles without replenishing them. In addition to the building materials and the necessary tools and appliances for putting them together, the cargo of the Avondale had included an ample supply of stores of all kinds, not the least important of which consisted of a quantity of power cylinders sufficient to provide the whole fleet 3 times over. The necessary chemicals and apparatus for charging them were also on board, and the last use that Arnold made of the engines of the steamer, which he had disconnected from the propeller and turned to all kinds of uses during the building operations, was to connect them with his storage pumps and charge every available cylinder to its utmost capacity. At length, when everything that could be carried in the airships had been taken out of the steamer, she was towed out into deep water, and then a shot from one of the flagship's broadside guns sent her to the bottom of the sea, so severing the last link which had connected the now isolated band of revolutionists with the world on which they were ere long to declare war. The naming of the fleet was by common consent left to Natasha, and her half-oriental genius naturally led her to appropriately name the airships after the winged angels and air spirits of Muslim and other Eastern mythologies. The flagship she named the Ithuriel, after the angel who was sent to seek out and confound the powers of darkness in that terrific conflict between the upper and nether worlds, which was a fitting antitype to the colossal struggle which was now to be waged for the empire of the earth. Arnold's first task as soon as the fleet finally took the air was to put the captains and crews of the vessels through a thorough drilling in management and evolution. A regular code of signals had been arranged by means of which orders as to formation, speed, altitude and direction could be at once transmitted from the flagship. During the day, flags were used, and at night, flashes from electric reflectors. The scene of these evolutions was practically the course taken by the Ariel from Aeria to the island, and as the captains and lieutenants of the different vessels were all men of high intelligence and carefully selected for the work, and as the mechanism of the airships was extremely simple, the whole fleet was well in hand by the time the mountain mass of Aeria was sighted a week after leaving the island. Arnold in the Ithuriel led the way to a narrow defile in the southwestern side, which had been discovered during his first visit, and which admitted of entrance to the valley at an elevation of about 3,000 feet. Through this the fleet passed in single file soon after sunrise one lovely morning in the middle of June, and within an hour the 13 vessels had come to rest on the shores of the lake. Then, for the first time, probably since the beginning of the world, the beautiful valley became the scene of busy activity, in the midst of which the lean, wiry figure of Lewis Holt seemed to be here, there and everywhere at once, doing the honours of Aeria as though it were a private estate to which the terrorists had come by his special invitation. He was more than ever delighted with the airships, and especially with the splendid proportions of the Ithuriel and the brilliant lustre of her polished hull, which had been left unpainted, and shone as though her plates had been of burnished silver. Altogether he was well pleased with this invasion of a solitude which, in spite of its great beauty and his professed contempt for the world in general, had for the last few months been getting a good deal more tedious than he would have cared to admit. In the absence of Natas and the chief, the command of the new colony devolved, in accordance with the latter's directions, upon Nicholas Roberov, who was a man of great administrative powers, and who set to work without an hour's delay to set his new kingdom in order, marking out sites for houses and gardens, and preparing materials for building them, and the factories for which the water power of the valley was to be utilised. Arnold, as Admiral of the fleet, had transferred the command of the Ariel to Colston, but he retained him as his lieutenant in the Ithuriel for the next voyage, partly because he wanted to have him with him on what might prove to be a momentous expedition, and partly because Natasha, who was naturally anxious to rejoin her father as soon as possible, wished to have Radna for a companion in place of the princess, who had elected to remain in the valley. As another separation of the lovers, who, according to the laws of the Brotherhood, now only waited for the formal consent of Natas to their marriage, was not to be thought of, this arrangement gave everybody the most perfect satisfaction. 3 days sufficed to get everything into working order in the new colony, and on the morning of the 4th, the Ithuriel, having on board the original crew of the Ariel, reinforced by 2 engineers and a couple of sailors, rose into the air amidst the cheers of the assembled colonists, crossed the northern ridge, and vanished like a silver arrow into space. End of chapter 18.